Nobody thought twice about it at first. A 13-year-old boy out along the muddy edge of Coldwater Creek before school, digging holes with a borrowed spade. His boots were already ruined by the time his mother called him in for breakfast. His hands were blistered by Tuesday. By Thursday, the neighbors had noticed. Everett Crane didn't explain himself. He just kept digging. He'd hauled in bundles of willow whips, those long, flexible shoots cut from mature trees, and he was pressing them into the soft soil right along the bank of the creek, one every few feet, dozens of them, all the way from the old fence post near the pasture gate to the wide curve where the water slowed in summer. People in Casey County, Kentucky had seen plenty of strange things, but a boy planting shade trees along a flood-prone creek in late autumn with no leaves on them and winter coming in hard, that was something people talked about at the feed store. If stories like this one, or stories of quiet wisdom, patience, and real farming lessons, mean something to you, hit subscribe and join our growing farming family, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to welcome you. Everett Crane was the second of 4 children on a tobacco and cattle farm that had been in the family since his great-grandfather broke ground on it in 1908. His father, Dale Crane, was a practical man. Fair, hard-working, not given to wasted motion. His mother, Ruth Ann, kept the books and raised the children and somehow found time to grow the best kitchen garden in the county. Everett was not the loudest Crane. His older brother Micah got the ribbons at the county fair. His younger sister Lena got the grades. But Everett was the one who walked the fence line every Sunday morning, not because anyone asked him to, but because he liked to see what had changed. He was the one who noticed one spring that the south field drained slower than it used to. He was the one who found a dead calf and traced the trouble back to a loose wire 3 days before anyone else spotted it. He didn't talk much about what he noticed. He just watched, and filed things away. The planting started the October after Everett turned 13. He'd asked his father for permission to work the creek bank. Dale Crane had looked at him for a long moment and said, "Long as you're not neglecting your chores." That was all the blessing Everett needed. He ordered willow whips from a conservation nursery, paid for them himself with money he'd saved from helping bale hay for the Atchison farm down the road. When the bundle arrived, his neighbor Harlan Beecham leaned on the fence post and squinted at the sticks. "What in the world are those?" "Willows," Everett said. "For shade." "Sort of." Harlan scratched his jaw and said nothing more, but he told his wife that evening that the Crane boy was out there planting sticks in the mud. She laughed and said it sounded about right for him. Old Gus Whitfield drove by on his tractor, slowed down and called over, "Boy, you know those creek banks flood out every few years? Anything you plant there is going to wash straight to Tennessee." Everett nodded politely and kept pressing whips into the ground. His own father watched from a distance once or twice, neither encouraging nor discouraging. Ruth Ann asked him at dinner what he was hoping to grow. Everett said he'd explain when there was something to explain. Nobody pushed him. That was the kind of family they were. What nobody knew, not even Dale, was where Everett had gotten the idea. The previous summer, during the 2 weeks he'd stayed with his maternal grandfather, Lester Bowen, over in Bourbon County, something had happened. Lester was a former soil conservation technician who had spent 30 years helping farmers stop losing ground they couldn't afford to lose. He was 74 and mostly retired, but his mind was still sharp as a draw knife. One evening they'd walked down to a neighbor's ruined creek bank, the kind of erosion that looks like someone took a spoon to the earth. Lester had stood there quietly for a while, then said, "You know what fixes this?" Everett didn't know. "Willows," Lester said. "Plant them close along the bank. Give them 2-3 years. The roots go down deeper than you'd think. They lace themselves right into the soil, anchor the bank from underneath. Water can rise and push and pull, but those roots hold the structure. Together, they slow the water down along the edge, catch the sediment, keep the bank from caving." He'd handed Everett a thin booklet from the County Extension Service, printed on cheap paper, edges soft from handling. Stream bank stabilization using native vegetation. Everett had read it twice on the bus ride home. What Lester had described was real, practiced conservation science. Willows, particularly the black willow, native to much of the American South and Midwest, are one of the most effective natural tools for protecting stream banks. Their root systems are aggressive and fibrous. They colonize moist soil quickly. They flex under pressure rather than break. Planted along a creek bank, they work like a mesh beneath the surface, binding the soil against the lateral force of moving water. Everett had understood it the way only a boy who walks fence lines understands things. Not as theory, but as something that would actually matter someday. The first winter was brutal to the willows. A hard freeze in January killed back several of the whips entirely. A section of the herd found a gap in the temporary fencing Everett had built, and trampled a dozen of his plantings before he discovered the damage. He repaired the fence and replaced the whips with cuttings he'd taken from the original stock and rooted in buckets of creek water in the barn. In May, aphids hit the new growth hard. Everett treated what he could. Some he lost anyway. Gus Whitfield passed by again in early summer, saw the patchy, struggling saplings, and shook his head. "Might as well have planted broom handles," he said, not unkindly. There were days Everett wondered if Gus was right. The whips that survived the freeze were pencil-thin and slow. A late summer dry spell turned the creek low and listless, and the exposed bank cracked in the heat. 2 of the saplings nearest the curve simply gave up and went brown. He pulled them and replanted with fresh cuttings, pressing them deeper this time, tamping the soil tight around each one with the heel of his boot. His brother Micah watched him one afternoon and said, "You know they're just trees, right? The creek's going to do what it wants." Everett didn't answer. He kept tamping. The second year was better. The willows that survived the first winter put down serious roots. By midsummer of that year you could see them clearly, a ragged but thickening line of green along Coldwater Creek, their long leaves trailing in the current when the water ran high. Still, most people in the county didn't give them a second thought. The summer Everett turned 15 was one of the driest in memory, and then, as though the sky was making up for lost time, it rained for 11 days straight in October. Not constantly, not a deluge, but steady. The kind of rain that soaks into everything until the ground can't hold another drop. Old Rufus Dinkins, who farmed the bottomland 2 miles east, told Dale Crane at the co-op that the creek was running higher than he'd seen since 1993. Dale went home and checked his own banks that evening. The water was deep and fast and brown. Birds had been strange all week. The killdeer that nested near the creek had moved their feeding ground uphill 3 days earlier. Everett had noticed that. He hadn't said anything to anyone, but he'd walked the willow line twice the day before the worst of it came, pressing his hand against the trunks, feeling the roots pull tight beneath the soil like cables under load. The county had issued a flood advisory that afternoon. Dale nailed it to the barn door. The family ate supper quietly that night, listening to rain on the tin roof. It came on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, Coldwater Creek had jumped its banks in 4 places, between the Whitfield farm and the Atchison farm to the east. Gus Whitfield lost 60 feet of bank on his north pasture. Just gone. A ragged new edge where his fence used to be. Topsoil carried off in brown sheets. 3 of the Atchison fence lines were down, posts and wire tangled in debris, 200 yards downstream. The low road between their farms was underwater until Saturday. Rufus Dinkins lost the better part of a hay meadow he'd been building up for 12 years. The soil there was dark and loose from years of careful tending, and the water took it fast. He stood at the edge of what remained on Friday afternoon, with his hands in his pockets, and didn't say anything for a long time. But on the Crane farm, Coldwater Creek had stayed closer to its channel, not perfectly. The water had spread into the low edge of the south pasture, but the bank itself, the long stretch where Everett had planted 2 years before, had held. Where neighboring banks showed raw, crumbling earth, the Crane bank showed willow roots, exposed in places, yes, bent and mudded, but still gripping the soil. The channel had not shifted. The topsoil behind it was largely intact. The reason was exactly what Lester Bowen had described on that summer evening in Bourbon County. The willow roots had laced through the bank's subsoil, creating a living net. When the water rose and pushed laterally against the bank, it met resistance, not from a hard structure, but from a flexible, fibrous one that bent without breaking. Sediment that would have peeled away was held in place. The bank's structural integrity, reinforced by 2 years of root growth, had absorbed what would otherwise have been catastrophic erosion. Nobody made a speech about it. Gus Whitfield came over on the following Monday to look at the damage, or rather, the lack of it. He stood at the edge of the Crane bank for a long time, boots still muddy from his own ruined pasture. He didn't say much. He asked Everett where he'd gotten the willows. Everett told him about the conservation nursery and wrote down the name on a piece of paper. Gus folded it into his chest pocket. The following spring, Harlan Beecham planted a row of willows along his section of the creek. The year after that, so did the Atchisons. Nobody announced it. It just spread, the way useful things do in farming communities, quietly through observation and need. Everett Crane never told anyone he'd known it would work. He didn't need to. The creek bank said it for him. There's a line from Wendell Berry that stays with you when you think about what happened on that farm. The soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Everett hadn't been trying to be wise. He'd been trying to protect something. A piece of ground his family had worked for generations. A creek bank that everyone else had simply accepted as temporary. He'd learned from someone older that the land will hold if you give it the right tools and enough time. The willows are still there. They're taller now and the roots go deeper every year. That's not a metaphor, it's just how willows work. And sometimes, the most practical thing you can do looks foolish right up until the moment the water rises. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from.